The richest families in history. Gone. In the final decades of the 19th century, America's great fortunes rose with breathtaking speed. Railroads stitched the continent together. Steel framed the sky, oil lit the night. Along Fifth Avenue and the cliffs of Newport, palaces of limestone and marble appeared almost overnight, built not merely as homes but as declarations. These were the residences of families who seemed untouchable, dynasties whose names crowned libraries, universities, museums, and entire industries. They hosted balls beneath frescoed ceilings, dined beneath crystal chandeliers imported from Europe, and moved through rooms designed to rival Versailles. Newspapers chronicled their weddings as if they were royal ceremonies. Their wealth felt permanent, their dominance unquestionable. Yet within a generation, many of those families began to fade. The Gilded Age promised permanence but delivered volatility. Fortunes built on rail lines could be shattered by regulation. Empires forged in coal or copper were vulnerable to labor unrest and shifting markets. The public mood changed as well. The same industrial titans once praised as visionaries were increasingly criticized as monopolists. Antitrust laws chipped away at corporate empires. Progressive reformers challenged the concentration of wealth. Estates that once symbolized triumph came to represent excess. The great mansions themselves tell the story. In Newport, entire avenues of summer cottages now operate as museums, preserved not because families still inhabit them, but because they could no longer sustain them. Ballrooms designed for orchestras fell silent. Formal gardens grew wild. Servants' quarters emptied as domestic service declined in the 20th century. A lifestyle requiring dozens, sometimes hundreds of staff became economically and socially untenable. Inheritance, paradoxically, proved as dangerous as competition. First-generation magnates possessed singular drive, obsession, and often ruthless clarity. Their children inherited security, not struggle. Divided estates splintered wealth into smaller portions. Some heirs proved capable stewards, others drifted into scandal, debt, or indifference. Trusts meant to preserve fortunes sometimes froze them in outdated investments. Taxes, once negligible, expanded dramatically in the early 20th century, eroding family capital with each transfer. War accelerated the unraveling. The First World War disrupted global finance and trade networks that underpinned many fortunes. The Great Depression devastated asset values. Families that had leveraged holdings to expand their reach found themselves overextended. Estates were sold quietly, sometimes at fractions of their former value. In cities like New York, entire stretches of mansion-lined avenues were demolished to make way for apartment towers. The architectural evidence of dominance disappeared, block by block. Social transformation further weakened dynastic continuity. The rigid hierarchies that once governed elite circles softened. Marriage alliances, once strategic consolidations of wealth, lost urgency as society democratized. Women gained greater independence, often choosing careers or lives beyond the domestic expectations that had once anchored family structures. Younger generations questioned inherited privilege, sometimes abandoning ancestral homes for modern lifestyles. The old codes of conduct, dress, and social ritual faded, leaving behind empty frameworks. Some families attempted reinvention. They converted estates into schools, foundations, or public institutions. Philanthropy became both moral obligation and practical solution. Museums, libraries, and concert halls bear witness to that transition. Private wealth translated into public legacy. Yet even philanthropy could not guarantee continuity of influence. Foundations professionalized, trustees replaced bloodlines. The family name endured on stone facades, but the living presence behind it dissolved. Scandal, too, hastened disappearance. Financial mismanagement, public divorces, and criminal accusations chipped away at reputations, once guarded with fierce discretion. The media, increasingly aggressive in the 20th century, found appetite in the downfall of the mighty. Headlines that once celebrated lavish galas now dissected bankruptcies and court proceedings. Public fascination shifted from admiration to scrutiny. Urban evolution completed what economics began. Neighborhoods changed. Industrial corridors became commercial districts. Private carriages gave way to automobiles, stables became garages, then boutiques. Maintaining a 60-room townhouse in Manhattan proved impractical in a world of rising land values and property taxes. Developers offered sums too substantial to refuse. Families relocated to smaller residences or dispersed entirely. What had once been a concentrated social world fragmented geographically and culturally. Memory plays its own role in disappearance. Names that once dominated headlines now survive primarily in footnotes or museum placards. A few endure, attached to universities or charitable trusts, but many have slipped quietly into obscurity. Their letters gather dust in archives. Their portraits hang in galleries, admired for artistic merit rather than social rank. The context that once made them powerful has receded beyond living memory. And yet, the disappearance is not absolute. It is transformation. Wealth did not vanish. It redistributed, rebranded, and redefined itself. New industries, technology, finance, media, generated their own elites. Glass towers replaced limestone palaces. Philanthropy adapted to modern structures. Where orchestras once played in private ballrooms, foundations now fund public arts initiatives. The architecture of influence shifted from marble staircases to corporate boardrooms. The contrast between permanence and impermanence defines the Gilded Age legacy. Those families built as if constructing for eternity. They commissioned architects to carve their ambitions into stone, believing solidity equaled survival. But history proved less predictable. Markets shift, laws evolve, social values transform. Even the grandest facade cannot anchor relevance forever. Walking through preserved estates, today, one senses both opulence and absence. The scale remains astonishing. Hand-painted ceilings, imported tapestries, gilded mirrors reflecting rooms désignés for spectacle. Yet the human energy that animated those spaces is gone. The laughter of guests, the urgency of business conversations, the ambitions whispered in libraries, all have dissipated. What remains is echo. The Gilded Age families who disappeared did not vanish in a single dramatic collapse. Their fading unfolded across decades, through quiet sales, diluted inheritances, cultural shifts, and the steady erosion of singular authority. They illustrate a broader truth about power. It is rarely permanent, no matter how invincible it appears at its height. In their rise lies the story of industrial America's explosive growth. In their decline lies the story of modernization, regulation, democratization, and reinvention. The mansions stand as monuments not only to wealth but to impermanence. They remind us that dominance in one era does not guarantee relevance in the next. The families who once defined an age now exist largely as chapters in history books, their legacies embedded in institutions rather than in living dynasties. Their disappearance is less a mystery than a mirror, reflecting the restless, transformative nature of the nation that created them. In the final decades of the 19th century, America witnessed one of the most explosive expansions of wealth in modern history. Railroads stretched like steel arteries across the continent, binding distant territories into a single economic organism. Oil fields transformed dark crude into illumination and industry. Steel mills roared day and night, forging the skeleton of a new urban skyline. Banking houses consolidated capital on an unprecedented scale. Out of this industrial surge emerged families whose fortunes were not merely large, they were staggering in their magnitude and influence. Their names became synonymous with progress, ambition, and power. These families did not simply accumulate wealth, they engineered systems. Railroad magnates controlled the movement of goods across thousands of miles. Industrialists standardized production processes that reshaped global markets. Financiers orchestrated mergers and trusts that centralized industries under singular corporate umbrellas. Vertical integration and consolidation became the strategies of dominance. By controlling supply chains from raw materials to distribution, they minimized competition and maximized leverage. Efficiency translated directly into profit, and profit into expansion. The rapid accumulation of capital allowed these families to construct physical symbols of permanence. Along Fifth Avenue in New York and the cliffs of Newport, Rhode Island, monumental residences rose in limestone, granite, and marble. These were not homes in the traditional sense, they were statements of arrival. Architects trained in Europe designed facades inspired by French chateaux and Italian palazzi. Imported tapestries lined walls. Ballrooms glittered with crystal chandeliers. Staircases swept upward beneath frescoed ceilings. Each detail reinforced the same message: this wealth was not fleeting, it was dynastic. Architecture functioned as social strategy. In cities, these mansions formed elite corridors where proximity equaled influence. Invitations to private dinners and winter balls were as powerful as business contracts. Social alliances reinforced financial alliances. Marriages between prominent families consolidated LTH and strengthened networks. Reputation became currency, guarded carefully through etiquette, philanthropy, and selective visibility. Appearances mattered, and so did legacy. Industrial power also reshaped the broader economy in ways that reinforced elite status. Control over rail transport meant the ability to influence shipping rates and determine which businesses flourished. Ownership of steel production meant dominance over construction, infrastructure, and machinery. Oil refineries determined energy supply. Banking institutions financed expansion across multiple sectors. These families occupied positions where economic decisions carried national consequences. Their private boardrooms often shaped public realities. Yet their ascent was not solely economic, it was cultural. Wealth demanded refinement. Art collections grew rapidly, with masterpieces imported from Europe to signal sophistication. Philanthropy funded libraries, universities, and museums. Donations were both generous and strategic, attaching family names to institutions that would endure beyond individual lifetimes. In this way, industrial wealth translated into cultural capital. Influence expanded beyond factories and rail yards into education, the arts, and public life. The Gilded Age environment encouraged bold risk-taking. The United States was still expanding westward, and infrastructure lagged behind opportunity. Visionaries invested in rail lines that connected remote territories. They financed bridges, tunnels, and ports that facilitated commerce. In doing so, they accelerated national growth while multiplying personal fortunes. Industrial capitalism, largely unregulated at the time, allowed aggressive tactics, price wars, acquisitions, and the formation of monopolistic trusts. Success favored those willing to act decisively and at scale. Public perception during the early phase of this expansion often leaned toward admiration. Newspapers celebrated industrial titans as embodiments of the American dream. Their narratives fit the mythology of self-made success. Even when fortunes originated from inherited advantage, the scale of achievement appeared extraordinary. The nation was transforming rapidly, and these families seemed to be architects of that transformation. Technological innovation further amplified their dominance. Advances in manufacturing reduced costs and increased output. Communication systems such as the telegraph allowed near-instant coordination across vast distances. Financial instruments evolved, enabling complex investments and consolidations. Industrial leaders adapted quickly to these innovations, leveraging them to outpace competitors. Scale became both weapon and shield. The accumulation of such wealth altered the rhythm of society. Entire industries revolved around servicing elite lifestyles, luxury goods, couture fashion, fine dining, bespoke architecture. Domestic staff numbers soared in urban mansions, supporting elaborate routines of hosting and entertaining. Private rail cars transported families across the country in comfort. Seasonal migrations between city residences and coastal estates established patterns of leisure previously reserved for European aristocracy. Despite outward displays of opulence, the driving force behind this rise remained industrial discipline. Many first-generation magnates maintained rigorous work habits. They monitored markets closely, analyzed production figures, and negotiated tirelessly. Their fortunes were built not only on ambition, but on meticulous management. Efficiency in operations translated into exponential growth. Profits were reinvested strategically, compounding influence year after year. By the turn of the 20th century, the scale of these fortunes had reshaped the national hierarchy. Economic power concentrated within a relatively small circle of families whose decisions could influence markets and policy. Their homes stood as architectural manifestations of confidence in permanence. Marble facades suggested endurance. Carved crests hinted at hereditary continuity. The visual language mirrored European nobility, yet the source of power was distinctly American, industrial capitalism operating at unprecedented velocity. This extraordinary rise defined the Gilded Age. It was an era when opportunity and exploitation coexisted, when innovation and inequality advanced in tandem. The families who stood at the apex believed they were building not merely companies, but legacies. They constructed their empires with the assumption that dominance could be inherited, that influence could be fortified, through architecture, philanthropy, and social consolidation. For a moment in history, it appeared as though their foundations were unshakable. At the height of their dominance, the great industrial families appeared insulated from disruption. Their names commanded respect in boardrooms, newspapers, and drawing rooms alike. Yet beneath the polished surface of marble facades and orchestrated galas, forces were gathering that would gradually erode the foundations of dynastic power. The decline did not arrive with a single dramatic collapse. It unfolded slowly, shaped by economic volatility, legal reform, generational change, and the shifting values of a modernizing nation. One of the most significant pressures came from regulation. As public awareness of monopolistic practices grew, political momentum shifted. Antitrust legislation targeted the vast corporate consolidations that had enabled unprecedented concentration of power. Trusts that once operated with near-total market control were dismantled or restructured. Government oversight expanded, limiting the aggressive tactics that had fueled explosive growth. Industries once shaped by private authority now faced public accountability. The era of unchecked expansion gave way to scrutiny. Economic instability compounded the strain. The panic of 1893 exposed vulnerabilities in speculative investment and railroad overextension. Later, the stock market crash of 1929 delivered a far more devastating blow. Asset values plummeted. Dividends shrank. Investments that once seemed invincible evaporated almost overnight. Families whose wealth was heavily tied to market performance discovered that liquidity was not the same as permanence. Maintaining vast estates, staffs, and social obligations required cash flow that no longer existed. Some were forced to sell properties quietly, others mortgaged assets in attempts to preserve appearances. Inheritance itself proved a complicated inheritance. The first generation of magnates had built fortunes through relentless discipline and risk tolerance. Their heirs inherited comfort rather than struggle. Estates divided among multiple children reduced concentrated control. Trust structures intended to protect wealth sometimes restricted flexibility, freezing capital in outdated industries. As decades passed, dilution became inevitable. What had once been a unified empire fractured into smaller holdings, each less capable of commanding national influence. Taxation further accelerated the redistribution of wealth. Estate taxes increased significantly in the early 20th century, especially during and after wartime periods when governments required revenue. Each generational transfer diminished the overall capital available to sustain dynastic dominance. Families accustomed to thinking in terms of permanence were forced to confront fiscal realities that made maintaining multi-acre urban residences increasingly impractical. World events reshaped global markets and social hierarchies. The First World War disrupted trade networks and financial stability. International investment suffered. Later, the Second World War demanded industrial realignment and national sacrifice. Luxury lifestyles became less socially acceptable during periods of hardship. The moral climate shifted. Conspicuous consumption no longer symbolized aspiration, but excess. Public admiration for industrial titans transformed into skepticism, even resentment. Urban transformation also undermined traditional elite enclaves. Cities expanded upward and outward. Land values soared, making low-density mansions economically inefficient. Developers offered enormous sums for single-family properties occupying prime urban blocks. Demolition became common, replacing private residences with commercial buildings or high-rise apartments. Entire avenues once lined with aristocratic townhouses vanished. The architectural expressions of dominance were erased, sometimes within a single decade. Social structures evolved as well. The rigid codes governing elite society softened. Marriage ceased to function primarily as a consolidation of assets. Romantic choice increasingly replaced strategic alliance. Women pursued education, careers, and autonomy beyond domestic expectations. Younger generations sought independence from ancestral obligations. Maintaining a 50-room residence staffed by dozens of employees felt increasingly detached from modern life. Domestic service itself declined as labor markets shifted and industrial employment offered alternative opportunities. Scandal and mismanagement played quieter but equally significant roles. Not every heir possessed financial acumen. Speculative ventures, ill-advised partnerships, or extravagant spending habits eroded capital. Publicized divorces and legal disputes damaged reputations once guarded by discretion. Media coverage expanded in reach and aggressiveness, turning private difficulties into public spectacle. The mystique that had shielded earlier generations weakened under constant exposure. Philanthropy offered both solution and symptom. Donating estates to foundations or converting mansions into institutions preserved buildings but signaled retreat from private dominance. Universities, museums, and cultural centers benefited from generous endowments, yet control shifted from family bloodlines to professional boards. Names remained engraved in stone, but decision-making authority dispersed. Influence became institutional rather than hereditary. Cultural attitudes toward wealth underwent transformation. Progressive reformers emphasized fairness and social responsibility. Labor movements demanded improved wages and working conditions. The narrative of the self-made titan lost some of its luster as public discourse highlighted inequality. Industrial leaders once celebrated as visionaries were re-examined through more critical lenses. Public admiration grew conditional rather than automatic. Geographic dispersal further diluted cohesion. Descendants relocated across the country or abroad. Without centralized residences or shared enterprises, family identity fragmented. Annual gatherings became symbolic rather than strategic. Shared purpose faded. What had once been tightly managed empires turned into diversified portfolios scattered across sectors and regions. Technological evolution also rendered certain industries obsolete. Railroads lost primacy to automobiles and aviation. Energy markets diversified. Manufacturing shifted toward new processes. Families whose wealth remained concentrated in older sectors struggled to adapt. Reinvention required agility that multi-generational estates sometimes lacked. The disappearance of Gilded Age dynasties was therefore not a singular event, but an accumulation of pressures. Regulation limited dominance. Economic crises drained liquidity. Taxes redistributed capital. Social change altered priorities. Urban development erased physical symbols. Generational shifts diluted cohesion. Each factor alone might have been manageable. Together they reshaped the landscape of power. What remained were fragments, endowments, foundations, preserved estates, and surnames etched into institutional history. The concentrated authority that once defined these families dissolved into broader systems. Influence survived, but in altered form. Wealth persisted in diversified channels rather than singular empires. The spectacle of marble staircases and gilded ballrooms gave way to quieter expressions of legacy. The decline of these families reflects the broader evolution of modern America. Industrial capitalism matured into regulated markets. Aristocratic mimicry yielded to democratic sensibilities. Permanence proved conditional. Even the grandest fortunes, fortified by architecture and alliance, proved vulnerable to time, policy, and change. As the concentrated dynasties of the Gilded Age receded from public dominance, their influence did not vanish. it transformed. Wealth that once expressed itself through private palaces and tightly controlled corporations gradually flowed into institutions designed to outlast individual lifetimes. The marble mansions that had symbolized supremacy became museums. Private libraries became public research centers. Estates evolved into universities, parks, and cultural foundations. In this shift from personal empire to institutional legacy, permanence found a new form. Philanthropy became the bridge between decline and endurance. For many industrial families, large-scale giving was initially a strategy to legitimize vast fortunes accumulated in eras of limited regulation. Over time, it evolved into a defining feature of their legacy. Endowed chairs at universities, hospital wings, concert halls, and public monuments carried surnames long after family members withdrew from daily prominence. Influence no longer depended on social season invitations or concentrated stock ownership. It resided in boardrooms, academic programs, and cultural institutions funded by earlier capital. Museums provide some of the clearest examples of this transformation. Art collections once displayed in private drawing rooms moved into public galleries, accessible to millions. Masterpieces acquired as symbols of refinement became shared cultural assets. The act of donation altered the meaning of ownership. Instead of reinforcing exclusivity, these works expanded public access to global artistic heritage. In doing so, former symbols of private distinction became instruments of collective enrichment. Educational institutions likewise absorbed industrial wealth. Universities expanded campuses, funded scholarships, and established research centers supported by endowments created generations earlier. Scientific advancement, medical innovation, and intellectual inquiry flourished under the financial scaffolding of Gilded Age capital. The transformation of personal fortune into educational infrastructure ensured that influence continued not through lineage alone, but through knowledge production and societal contribution. The physical estates themselves underwent reinterpretation. Some were demolished, yet others survived by adapting to new purposes. Summer cottages along coastal enclaves now operate as historic sites, attracting visitors eager to glimpse the scale of a bygone era. These preserved mansions function less as celebrations of excess and more as educational artifacts. They narrate stories of industrial growth, labor dynamics, architectural ambition, and social stratification. Their preservation allows reflection on both achievement and inequality. Foundations emerged as enduring vehicles of transformation. Structured to operate beyond the lifespan of any single heir, they professionalized philanthropy. Trustees, financial managers, and policy experts replaced family patriarchs as stewards of capital. Decision-making became data-driven and mission-focused. The shift ensured continuity but diluted personal identity. The surname remained attached, yet operational authority rested in broader governance structures. Influence persisted, but its character changed from intimate control to strategic oversight. Cultural memory also preserved fragments of dynastic impact. Literature, film, and scholarship continue to revisit the era, exploring both its glamour and its contradictions. The Gilded Age occupies a unique place in American imagination, a time of dazzling ambition and stark inequality. Through storytelling and historical study, the families who once defined that age remain subjects of fascination. Their narratives inform contemporary debates about wealth concentration, corporate responsibility, and social mobility. Economic transformation further demonstrates that disappearance does not equal erasure. Capital reinvested in diversified industries continued to generate returns across generations. Financial instruments evolved, but underlying assets often remained productive. Some descendants pursued quieter paths in finance, academia, or philanthropy, maintaining comfortable but less conspicuous lives. Public visibility declined, yet economic security endured. Urban landscapes reflect this layered legacy. In cities where mansions once stood, high-rise buildings now dominate. Yet street names, plaques, and institutional landmarks preserve traces of earlier ownership. Parks donated by industrial benefactors remain green refuges in dense metropolitan environments. Bridges, libraries, and civic structures, built with private funding, continue serving daily needs. The architectural language may have shifted, but foundational contributions remain embedded in the infrastructure of modern life. The transformation from spectacle to subtlety marks a broader cultural evolution. Contemporary elites rarely construct single-family urban palaces modeled on European aristocracy. Instead, wealth expresses itself through diversified investments, global mobility, and digital innovation. Philanthropy now addresses issues ranging from climate change to global health. The model pioneered in the late 19th century, converting industrial fortune into public institution, continues to shape modern giving, albeit with updated priorities. The endurance of legacy also depends on narrative framing. Historical interpretation evolves, reassessing both the achievements and shortcomings of industrial magnates. Museums contextualize wealth within labor struggles and economic inequality. Universities examine the complexities of monopoly and reform. Foundations reevaluate mission statements to align with contemporary value. Legacy becomes dynamic rather than static, continually reinterpreted through new ethical lenses. In this way, the disappearance of Gilded Age families from concentrated power did not mark an end but a diffusion. Authority dispersed across institutions, wealth translated into public goods, influence extended beyond bloodlines into broader civic frameworks. The visible symbols of dominance, ballrooms, private rail cars, opulent townhouses, may have faded or transformed, yet the structural impact remains woven into education, culture, infrastructure, and philanthropy. Time reshaped prominence into permanence of a different kind. The families who once stood atop industrial empires no longer command headlines as they once did, but their contributions persist in quieter forms. Libraries funded a century ago still lend books. Museums endowed generations earlier still hang paintings. Universities supported by early capital continue producing scholarship. Through transformation rather than survival in its original form, legacy found durability within the evolving architecture of society. In the end, the story of the Gilded Age families who disappeared is not simply about vanished fortunes or abandoned mansions. It is about the illusion of permanence. They built palaces of marble and limestone believing wealth could outlast time. They believed railroads, steel, oil, and finance would anchor their names to eternity. For a moment, it seemed true. Their estates stretched across oceans and lakes. Their ballrooms glittered beneath chandeliers imported from Europe. Their dinner tables shaped politics, culture, and industry. But power built on an era is vulnerable to the era's end. The Gilded Age was not just a period of wealth. It was a moment of transformation. Fortunes were made faster than at any time in American history. Entire industries rose within a generation. Yet those same forces of change, innovation, competition, shifting laws, social reform, global conflict, became the very currents that pulled many of these families under. What created them eventually consumed them. Some disappeared through division. Heirs who inherited millions often lacked the hunger or discipline that built the empire. Vast estates fractured under the weight of inheritance taxes, legal battles, and extravagant lifestyles. Palaces that once required dozens of staff became unsustainable relics. The grandeur remained, but the financial engine behind it stalled. Others faded because the world changed. Progressive reforms challenged monopolies. Public resentment toward excess wealth reshaped taxation and regulation. Wars redrew economic maps. New industries replaced old ones. The rail barons could not foresee aviation. The oil dynasties did not predict global energy politics. The financial titans could not guarantee immunity from crashes and depressions. What once felt invincible proved temporary. And then there was the quiet erosion of relevance. Some families retained wealth but lost influence. They became names in history books rather than forces in the present. Their mansions turned into museums. Their private retreats became public landmarks. The very spaces designed to display dominance became monuments to a vanished age. Yet their disappearance is not purely a tale of downfall. It is also a reflection of transformation. Wealth does not vanish, it shifts. Influence does not die, it evolves. The children of industrial magnates often redirected fortunes into philanthropy, education, and the arts. Foundations replaced factories as vehicles of legacy. Universities, libraries, and hospitals stand today where smokestacks once defined power. What endures is not the opulence, but the imprint. The Gilded Age families remind us that visibility is fleeting. In their time, they were the headlines, the spectacle, the symbol of American ambition. Newspapers chronicled their weddings as national events. Society pages documented their travels as if they were royalty. But fame anchored in wealth alone rarely survives beyond a few generations. Their disappearance teaches that legacy is not secured by size, not of fortune, nor of estates, nor of influence, but by adaptability and purpose. The families who endured did so by evolving with the nation. Those who clung to a single era became artifacts of it. As we look at their marble staircases, sweeping lawns, and portraits frozen in gilded frames, we see more than luxury. We see ambition at its peak and fragility beneath it. We see how quickly dominance can fade when history moves forward. Their story echoes into our own time, reminding us that today's giants may one day be tomorrow's footnotes. The Gilded Age promised permanence. Time proved otherwise, and so the vanished dynasties leave behind a quiet truth. Wealth may build empires, but only wisdom, reinvention, and humility can sustain them beyond the glitter of a single age.